Welcome everyone to our town hall with State Treasurer Joe Torsella. We're so happy to have you here tonight. On our panelist board today, we also have Colleen Kennedy. She is the treasurer for Center County. Greg Stewart, who is the chair for the Center County Democrats, and Dan McNamara, which is part of Joseph's staff. So before we get started, Joe, is there anything that you'd like to talk about before we dive in with the questions?
Sure, I'll give you, and those who've joined, a kind of general frame for understanding what we do and what I've done with the office, if I can. I'll first start by thanking everyone who's zoomed in. Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Ava, and thank you all of you for your work on behalf of the party and the Commonwealth. Thank you for helping me 4 years ago, get to what has been, for me, the most extraordinary opportunity I've ever had in public service, and I've had some interesting ones and some different ones. But broadly, just let me say it's great to be with you, even in this weird way, and maybe actually especially in this weird way, because as we are apart physically, it's kind of a good reminder that we're connected still in the ways that count. And that idea, more than anything else, is kind of mostly the way I think about my work in public service, that idea of connection, of togetherness, that we are an American or a Pennsylvania family. For me, the touchstone has always been the first 3 words of the U.S. Constitution. I headed the National Constitution Center for about a decade. And in looking back at American history, whenever we've lost our way, and there's a good argument we're lost at the moment, those words have always been the words that have brought us back home. Trying to remember that sense of an American family that is bigger than our differences and that is inclusive and open and diverse. And that may not sound, and it'd be interesting to compare notes with Colleen, it may not sound like that is the first thing a treasurer thinks about, but it is in my case, and I want to give you some examples about how it's sort of played out in the work that we've done. Back, a million years ago, when I decided to run for re-election, and before COVID-19 came on the scene, the way I thought about my job was essentially the way I communicated it to you at a breakfast nearly 4 years ago, where I said, basically, there were 3 promises that I was going to make. Number one, I was going to restore integrity to an office that had seen way too much scandal over the course of recent decades, where 3 of the last 5 elected treasurers had found themselves facing federal charges. And I'm proud to say I've done that. We, literally on my first day, in fact, on my first hour, we banned the insane and corrupt practice of using middlemen to land state investment contracts, a practice whereby somebody who knew somebody got paid a kind of annuity to introduce an investment manager to the state. In my first month, I implemented the first ever code of conduct and conflict of interest policy the Treasury's ever had. In my first year, I appointed the department's first ever chief integrity officer, and I reached into the ranks of the Corbett administration alumni to pick Tom Corbett's former inspector general to show I was serious about what we were trying to do. It wasn't just window dressing. And that work of restoring that sense of accountability and integrity and transparency, where we've won national and international plaudits for the work we've done to open up the state's books, will be something I think about every day on the job, because it goes to a broader issue of restoring public trust in public institutions. And restoring people's faith, for those of us who believe, as I do, that only government can accomplish certain tasks that we need to have accomplished. We have to make it our business to keep faith with taxpayers and to restore their sense of belief in the possibility of government to act effectively and with integrity. Second thing I said was that I was going to be a tough fiscal watchdog, because that's part of the role of this job. And I've done that in small ways by cutting Treasury's car fleet. Who knew? We even had one. By turning in the treasurers, not 1, but 2 cars. but in more profound ways by switching how we invest state money from actively managed funds to index funds, saving taxpayers $700 million in the process. And when necessary, taking on Wall Street pretty aggressively to do it. We led a suit suing the largest banks on Wall Street when we discovered they were cheating Pennsylvanians and other taxpayers. And at the end of it, they agreed to pay nearly $400 million to make the taxpayers whole for their actions. But the third thing I said was that I believe this office could have something to do with rebuilding that sense of that sense of community that I talked about, the sense in Pennsylvania, we call it, of being a commonwealth, turning back what is really a rising tide of inequality and trying to find bridges across some of our divisions. And we've done that in a couple ways. We've done that by using the power of your investments, which I'm the custodian of, to stand up for those values and to stand up for the idea that we're a community. So when opioid companies that have put their profits ahead of our safety in a way that's done particularly bad and lasting damage to Pennsylvania communities, we used our shares to demand changes in governance and changes in behavior. Just recently, and this is a story that's playing out, we used our shares to tell Gilead, the company that's manufacturing remdesivir, the only proven effective treatment for COVID-19, when they priced their cure at nearly 540 times the cost of manufacture, which is $1 a vial. We used our shares to say we thought it was outrageous, and stay tuned for the story. But I intend to keep going until we get them to change. We used our shares at Facebook to say the idea of one person being both the CEO and the chairman, especially when it's a company that has such profound impact on our economy, on our everyday lives, on our elections, and when there's been scandal after scandal there, we thought that was an outrageous abuse of corporate governance. When Donald Trump, might have been the first of what's now an endless series of bad decisions, pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord, we used our shares to say, now when it comes to Pennsylvania, we're still in, and to sign on to a multi-state coalition. So we've kind of used our commonwealth to express our commonwealth values. What we've also done, though, is really innovate in ways that can make a real difference for Pennsylvanians. Maybe most notably by creating the Keystone Scholars Program, which is, I talked about when I was running 4 years ago, the idea, now a reality, that every single child born in Pennsylvania, in every single zip code, gets at birth or adoption a $100 529 college savings account. And that $100 grows through investment over time. And also, though, is a powerful message to every kid in every corner of Pennsylvania and every community, that they're part of a community and that we believe in them and that we see them as having some future after high school, whether that's a certificate or a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree, but some kind of post-secondary education that increasingly in the 21st century economy is sort of the price of entry. We became the first large state in the country to do that, the only state to do it by legislation. We did it even in these divided times. I found a bipartisan coalition to support it. It's been featured on PBS and NBC. It's being copied around the country in other states, red and blue, which is a very nice change of pace in Pennsylvania to have other states copying our policy innovations. And it really goes to this idea that motivated me to run, and I think has become more important now as we're living through what are incredibly dark days of, in my view, the most dangerous and corrupt and divisive president in American history. The idea of reclaiming that sense of American community. Now, we can talk a little bit, and I hope I get the chance to, about what we've done here in the time of COVID, where we've doubled down on that idea by the way we've used this office. But let me just broadly say that, before this all happened, I had a long to-do list for what I hope to do in a second term. And at the top of that was creating portable automatic retirement accounts for 2.1 million working Pennsylvanians who don't have any way to save for retirement currently. And doing something that will give both helps the state financially, but more importantly, gives those folks, again, that sense that there's a community that's in some way has their back, and that we're not going to stand by and let them work their whole lives without the ability to build the possibility at least of a dignified retirement. I continue to make that, that remains number one on my priority list, but my experience of what we've been through over the past 6 months, frankly, makes me want to swing even bigger. That, again, going back to my time at the Constitution Center, my read of American history is that out of some of the darkest times have come some of the brightest chapters that follow. We saw out of World War II, we built the biggest, strongest middle class in history. Out of the turmoil of the 60s came the enormous advances of the civil rights movement. Out of the crisis of the Civil War, we remade our understanding of what our founding really meant and how inclusive it was. I think we're living through such a time, and I think our task as Pennsylvanians, as Americans, as Democrats, is to make that clear to people as we go through the next few weeks, and to make clear both the stakes and the possibilities. And when I look back at those times, they were choices. They involved leaders who asked us to see bigger, think bigger and not smaller, and to see in the challenges of that moment possibilities for something brighter around the bend. So my ambitions for Treasury have only grown. My ambitions for this job, my passion for public service, my belief in what's possible, all that has frankly expanded over the last 6 months. And I view this as an opportunity for all of us to stand up for some foundational values, to, of course, turn back what I think is a real threat to American democracy in the current occupant of the Oval Office, but frankly, to do more than that and do more than sort of get us back on track. It's to seize this kind of vision of who we are, that we can be a place where we can find ways that 2.1 million people can get retirement security, or that 140,000 babies born every year can get a kind of baby bond for higher education. And we can use the offices we all have, whether it's the treasurer of Center County or the treasurer of the Commonwealth, to work toward this idea. And that essentially is sort of who I am and who I try to be in public service. That's what's motivated my thinking about this job, and that's what I hope to get the chance to do if I get the chance to do this for another 4 years. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks. I'll thank you again for having me and putting up the question.
All right. Thank you so much, Joe. I was muted. That was really nice. So we're just going to kick it off with some questions. For the audience, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A. Colleen and I will sift through them and answer them as they come in. But let's start with the burning question that I know everyone has, which is, who else is behind the infamous State Treasury Twitter account?
Well, that is a State Treasury secret. I've been asked it in all kinds of clever ways. I have a great communications team. And the average age on that communications team is a lot younger than mine. And I think that accounts for some of the brilliance of the Twitter account. There actually is no single author to it. It's kind of a family effort. And I will tell you that I hear about it wherever I go. It proves that government at its best can be engaging. We've found a way to get folks, some folks who don't normally pay attention to state government, not just paying attention, but passionately interested. We've had a lot of really engaging, lively conversations on Twitter. It might be the one thing in my 4 years that our youngest daughter has sort of talked to me about the most. It was when she actually noticed what I did for a living, is because her friends were engaged by the Pennsylvania Treasury Twitter account.
Mhm.
So I'm proud of that fact. What I'm prouder about, though, is underneath that, there are people who, because of the Twitter account, have discovered they have unclaimed property, who've learned that their newborn is entitled to a college savings account, who've engaged in this dialogue and conversation we're having about retirement security, who've noticed some of the things that we've been saying and trying to get more attention paid to around how Wall Street has, frankly, in my view, been picking our pocket for years and years when it comes to public investments. So there's a whole cohort of of folks who are engaged with an important set of issues because of a lively and often funny and often irreverent Twitter account. I'm proud of that. So I'm glad you asked. I'm not going to give you any names.
That's all right. Well, if you need someone to join your team, I will humbly accept that. But to move on, some questions we have are, what are your thoughts on ethical investing?
Well, so to boil down my kind of view of ethical investing or ESG investing or whatever we want to call it, we have become much more active as a shareholder since I've been treasurer. We have become a much more engaged shareholder as a state over the last 3 years. Not on every issue, but on issues that I judge to be kind of core to who we are as a Commonwealth. So on climate issues, we've been very active. I mentioned the We're Still In campaign. We are part of climate action. We've been part of an effort to try and get utility companies to commit to net zero emissions by a date certain. We have used the power of our shares in a way that we hadn't in the past. We've used those shares around diversity in boardrooms, which is a topic that in the long overdue conversation we're having about racial justice, I think is really important. We've used the power of our shares around to be the first state treasurer to sign on to the Coalition for Responsible Firearm Manufacturers, which asks them to sign up to a number of kind of common sense principles, and some other things that I can talk about. But I say not on every issue, but on ones that go to that kind of core sense of we that I talked about. In part, I feel that the reason for doing that is we've shifted how we invest. So before I was treasurer, Pennsylvania Treasury was an active investor, meaning we paid Wall Street managers to manage our funds, and we could buy and sell securities. We are now index investors, meaning we buy the market, so to speak. But when you're an index investor, you are saying that we're not going to sell certain companies. We're going to buy the market as a whole, and we're going to hold on to that, from now until the end of time. And I know there's some view that divestment is a sensible approach, where you say to a company, well, we don't want to have anything to do with what you do, so we're gonna sell our shares and walk away. I don't share that view, because I think when you do that, you put down your authority. Had we divested from Facebook, I would have no standing for now 3 years in a row, each year with a higher and higher vote total, ask for Mark Zuckerberg to relinquish all the tight control he has and have some oversight. Had we divested from the companies that have done such damage on opioids, I wouldn't have had the ability to as a shareholder, ask them to change some of their practices, which they did. So I think when you're an index, and I'm a believer in engagement rather than divestment. But I think when you are an index investor, you have to be really truly engaged. You can't just phone it in. You have to be part of coalitions to stand up and demand, more ethical behavior on the part of corporations. And you have to try to make the argument, which is improved in study after study after study, that companies that actually do something more than in the very short run seek to goose their earnings actually do better in the long run. There's endless studies about diversity in corporate boardrooms translating into, over the long run, more profitable companies. There are endless studies now about the real cost of climate change, or maybe in the corporate context, the cost of climate change avoidance, and all of them lead to the same conclusion, which is the smarter choice for most companies is to lead and not resist efforts to combat climate change. So the long and the short of it is, Pennsylvania has never been more active as a shareholder around some of these issues. And to me, that's frankly very connected with how we've chosen to invest. By saying goodbye to Wall Street managers, we have more of an obligation to be a smarter shareholder who is asking companies to do better on many of the issues we all care about. I think that is truthfully the wave of the future. I think you're seeing it more and more. There was a letter that caused quite a stir about 2 years ago from the head of BlackRock, which is a major indexing company, where he said what I think a lot of us have felt for some time, which is that if a company is not accountable to its stakeholders as well as its shareholders, and if all it does is try and earn a short-term profit, that company is not a good holding. Now, this is the head of a major index company talking. This is a conclusion I think that the more enlightened parts of the financial world have arrived at. And I think you'll see more and more of this in the days ahead. So I'm proud that Pennsylvania, for a change of pace, has been leading in demanding different sets of behaviors from companies. I think, though, that you're going to see the course of people doing that grow and grow.
Absolutely. That's a really great point. And what would you say is an initiative that you'd like to take on in your next term?
The trouble is, I've got more initiatives than time. But the ones that I'm most passionate about, let me rewind a little bit. In the past 6 months, I have felt that what we've done at Pennsylvania Treasury has been maybe the most rewarding time I've ever spent in public service. It's also been, for all of us, I think, among the most exhausting times as we try to rise to this occasion of what this crisis is asking from us. But early on in the crisis, we used our shares to tell ventilator companies who were prohibiting hospitals from repairing their equipment that they should display a little public spirit. And glad to tell you that most of them actually agreed. That was a Pennsylvania-led initiative. We found a way to get rent rebate checks out to hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvanians months ahead of time, putting thousands of dollars, millions of dollars in the pockets of needy Pennsylvania families. We initiated and crafted and implemented the most generous, the most favorable student loan relief in the country for Pennsylvania borrowers because of a Treasury initiative that we undertook with the governor's office and the legislature and with FIA. We persuaded the largest banks in the country to, in Pennsylvania, agree to cash the stimulus checks for Pennsylvanians without fee and without penalty, putting tens of millions of dollars in Pennsylvania pockets. I mentioned the initiative with Gilead on the price of remdesivir. And we did all this while Treasury, like the rest of the world, has been largely working remotely in our effort to keep both the Treasury family, but also the Pennsylvania family safe. I tell you all that because that's a little bit of a window into what we've been able to achieve, but all of what we've done is, against a backdrop of a level of suffering that is unlike anything that I've ever lived through, and anything we've probably ever read about. I mean, start with the human cost of this pandemic, and think about all the Pennsylvania families who are missing a loved one. In many cases, somebody they had to say goodbye to over FaceTime if they said it at all. And then move to the economic cost, where our unemployment rate was among the very highest of all the 50 states. And this is in a state where we had some serious economic stagnation going into this crisis, where working families are finding it harder than ever to afford what they need, and where the cost of that thing I call the ticket to entry to the 21st century economy, higher education, has zoomed out of reach of most Pennsylvania families. While average incomes have stayed the same, cost of higher education has gone up by roughly 300%. So as I look over this period, what I see is a state that is reeling, both in the Harrisburg sense, depends how you count this, but estimates of what COVID has done to us in this fiscal year, the past fiscal year, and the current fiscal year is maybe on the order of $5 billion. But the state's finances are only ever a reflection of Pennsylvania's finances, of families. And those families are really, truly hurting. And we have not done nearly a good enough job in being creative and innovative and determined in figuring out how we are going to rebuild bridges to opportunity that I took for granted when I grew up many decades ago in north central Pennsylvania, but that are increasingly gone for families of today's Pennsylvania. And this crisis, I think, has revealed to the nation, among other fault lines, the unaddressed racial one that we've let fester for too long. It's revealed in some ways the illness COVID, I'm told, attacks the weakest part of a person's system. In some ways, I feel like that's what it's done at the Pennsylvania level. It's shown us where we're weak. It's shown us the things we've ignored for too long, like the cost of higher education becoming so out of reach. So my sense of urgency about a second term is a lot higher than it was even just 7 or 8 months ago. But it's around the issues I've just been talking about. It is around that issue of higher education. So I'm very proud of what we did with Keystones. I'm proud we made a kind of universal promise. I'm proud that it's getting people's attention. By the way, not to get weedsy and policy nerdy, but I can't help it. The study is back on what the first year of Keystones has done. It has doubled the rate at which parents are setting aside their own 529 account for their kids in every demographic and in every geography, meaning even single parent, no post-secondary education is now twice as likely within 12 months of a child being born to see a future for that child that goes beyond high school. And that is powerful and strong. And that's going to change. If we have a town meeting in 10 years, we're going to see a different rate of Pennsylvania kids who imagine and achieve a future for themselves than we would have. The power of even a small account at birth makes a kid 7 times more likely to go to and graduate something after high school. Think about that, 7 times more likely. I'm really proud of that, but it's not nearly enough. So about a week ago, we unveiled a plan that we've developed that would provide 2 years of tuition-free post-secondary education for every citizen in Pennsylvania. And we're going to need that now more than ever. We needed it before COVID-19, but with this crisis where 40% of the jobs, I'm told, that we've lost are probably not coming back. It's not just 18-year-olds who need this anymore. It's hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvanians who need to find ways to reinvent themselves. And I looked around the country, and our policy team looked around the country, and we came up with an idea that I intend to use every bit of energy and persuasion that I have to try and get the legislature and the governor to get behind, so that we can add our name to a list of now nearly 20 states that recognize that education after high school is no longer some kind of luxury. It's a necessity in this economy, and make Pennsylvania a state where 2 years tuition free for every Pennsylvanian. I could talk all night about the other ideas, and if you give me half a chance, I will. If you ask me what I'm most passionate about at the moment, it's probably that. And the reason for that, again, is what we've seen together is we have in Pennsylvania for far too long, and I love our state, but for far too long we've let some of these challenges and problems that are really growing the chasm that divides us. We've let them fester for way too long, and I want to get a sense of urgency about doing something about it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe. Well, I am looking forward to seeing what you do in your next term. But now I'm going to hand it off to Colleen and let the experts discuss finance in our state. So Colleen, take it away.
8 whole months on the job, and I'm an expert. Thank you. I appreciate your confidence. It's a tremendous pleasure for me to speak with Treasurer Torsella. I'm a huge fan, and I love nerding out about monetary policy. So we could continue, maybe after everyone hangs up, we'll just keep, going into the weeds. That'd be great. I'm going to build on what you were talking about, the Keystone program, the Keystone Scholars Program that you instituted. What was your impetus for instigating that specific program?
I'll tell you the day, and we should swap stories, Colleen, because we decided to make your history making run for this office. I'd be curious what persuaded you. The day that I decided to run for treasurer was the day that I read a story in the New York Times that said the only public officials in the country who were actually tackling issues of economic inequality were treasurers. And it talked about what treasurers were doing, ranging, by the way, from city and county treasurers to state treasurers, around these kinds of ideas. So some of it was around financial literacy, some of it was around kind of financial empowerment. But the idea that caught my heart was a pilot program that I think started in San Francisco. Then a couple of small states had tried it, that treasurers were spearheading to create at-birth accounts. And then I remembered, what I'd read about baby bonds. I connected suddenly a lot of dots about what the unaffordability and inaccessibility of higher education was doing to us as a state. And I saw the statistic that a kid was 7 times more likely to go to and graduate something after high school with even a very modest savings account at birth that was dedicated to higher education. And my first instinct was that can't possibly be true. How can that make a difference? If an account has $50 or $100 or $250 in it, why would that make a difference? And then I remembered my own childhood. I grew up in Berwick, Pennsylvania, which is in Columbia County. And by the way, I grew up going every single home game weekend to Penn State games because my dad was an insane Penn State fanatic. He passed away about 25 years ago, but he spent 1 year of his life and he played football for Penn State before he went off to the Army. And he loved it. We only knew after he passed away how many season tickets he had. when my mom found out, she was like, oh, that's where all the money went. And she was really angry. But we literally every weekend, and his view was a bowl game was an automatic school holiday for us kids. But I grew up in the small town of about 7,000. And I had a lot of well-meaning Italian aunts and uncles. And for every birthday, event, milestone, school graduation, they would give me a $25 savings bond and say, Joey, this is for your education. And when I was 8, 9, and 10, I thought it was the world's worst gift ever. But now that I'm, several decades older, I see it for what it was a great gift. It was a message. It was a message that got through to me because it wasn't so much the fact of the $25, although when you add up enough of those savings bonds, they helped me buy books. They helped me, put myself through college along with some loans and some grants and some work. But I think more valuable was the message that it gave me. It was a way for them to say, you're part of a community that has a belief in who you can be, and that in some way is here to help you and to help you, give you a hand when you need it, and maybe a push and a shove sometime. And suddenly, when I thought about it in those terms, this study and these studies made a lot of sense to me. And I thought, I want to do that in Pennsylvania. We are a state where the rate at which kids go on to something after college, and again, after high school, something doesn't need to be 4 years. Something could be anything from a certificate to a 2-year program. But our rate is well behind our competitor states. And that sense of community that I had in Berwick has been fractured by some of the forces that are pulling on American society. And I said, this program, this idea is a way of rebuilding that, not in the same way I had it growing up in Berwick, but in a different way, in a powerful way. And I said, I want to do that above all when I run for treasurer. And on the toughest days of campaigning, it has its joys. It's fun to talk to folks like you, but it also has its burdens. On those days where it had more burdens than joys, what I'd remember is I'm running to do this. I'm running to make a difference so that 130,000 Pennsylvania kids every year are going to have a different kind of future because I was Pennsylvania treasurer. So that's where I got the idea. I thought, frankly, it would take me a lot longer than it did. I'm thrilled that we were able to get bipartisan collaboration around that idea and able to implement it as soon as we did. And I'm thrilled that it's catching on around the country now.
Another program that you instituted that you didn't speak about yet is the PA ABLE program. And so I was wondering if you would speak to that. And forgive me, I didn't do my research. I'm not sure. I think that's something that you instigated, but I'm not sure if it was you or if it was a different program. So if you could speak to PA ABLE.
So we did launch ABLE on my watch. For those who don't know, the ABLE program is a program that lets disabled Pennsylvanians save and invest, and frankly, even bank for the first time in their lives without threatening the benefits they rely on. So before ABLE, which originated in federal legislation and then in state legislation, a disabled Pennsylvanian who's relying on public benefits was essentially told they had to remain poor. And parents were told, for example, they had to write disabled kids out of their wills. That any amount of assets above a trivial amount would trigger a loss of benefits. The federal government, thanks largely, and you all should know this, to our terrific U.S. Senator Bob Casey, passed the ABLE Act a couple of years ago that gave states the option of creating kind of a 529-like vehicle for disabled citizens. And I think Bob Casey is correctly incredibly proud of doing that. On my watch, we embraced that option and we launched ABLE. Not only did we launch ABLE, we are now by far the leading state in the many state ABLE coalition in the number of Pennsylvanians who are using it. We're up to more than 3,400 accounts. about 30-some million dollars. We are well ahead of any other state in the nation that's part of our, of this multi-state collaborative in doing this. And that's because we have some folks at Treasury who really believe in this program, who understand that it can change lives. We have in Pennsylvania an extraordinary community of disability advocates and families who've been part of this since the beginning. But there's a lot of years of worry that we have to overcome, because for years the Pennsylvania families with disabled family members were told, you cannot save any money. If you do save any money, you're jeopardizing all your benefits. And they heard that so often and so frequently that it's going to take time to overcome all that. But I'm really proud that we've, again, set a record in Pennsylvania on this. I'm really proud that we've launched it so well. And I will tell you, I've done a lot of, back in the day when you could do this, touring around the state to promote this. But learning what ABLE has meant for different Pennsylvanians has been one of the best ever parts of my job. There was a wheelchair basketball group in Pittsburgh that let me play, which I did very, very badly, which would break my father's athletic heart if he were still alive. But they explained to me that the cost of cost of being able to participate in wheelchair basketball or some form of sport like that it's a couple $1,000s they didn't have. I've met people for whom an ABLE account was their ability to save for that. I met a young man who's got a disability, but also has a job and was never able to simply bank and had to carry cash around, which was a threat to his safety, frankly. He now, he uses the banking function of the ABLE account. I met others who are saving for a trip or saving for some form of assistive technology, but every one of them has something they didn't have before, which is a sense of empowerment and autonomy and being able to do what they should have been allowed to do from the very beginning, which is save their own money. So ABLE is one of the more extraordinary programs in Pennsylvania Treasury. I wish more people knew about it. We're going to get there. We think that there are estimates that is several 100,000 Pennsylvanians could benefit from an ABLE account. So as proud as we are of those numbers, we want to get them up. The other thing I'll say is we're working with Bob Casey. The current legislation federally is that you have to have had a disability declared before your 20s, essentially, to qualify for an ABLE account. Well, we all know there are lots of examples of folks who get disabled later in life. Just think, for example, of a serviceman or woman who defends our country and then has a disability they have to grapple with. To raise that age to the 40s makes a lot of sense to us. So we're working to change that federally, which would make this an even more impactful program for many Pennsylvanians.
I have a sort of lighthearted comment / question for you. You have an opponent who is based in our county. Are you aware of him?
So I was not until I'm reading the chat screen. So, oh gee. As crazy as this sounds, I try not to think about who's running against me. I feel like I'm running for something. And what I'm running for is that vision that I started talking to all of you about of Pennsylvania as a we. So I don't spend a lot of time thinking about my opponents, but I was curious to discover one of them is from your area.
Yep. He almost ran against me, but then he dropped out of the race. So it's interesting information there.
Maybe the same thing will happen here.
We'll see. It looks like we are closing in on 8 o'clock, and so I didn't know if I wanted to kick this back to Ava and or Greg to wrap things up. Thank you so much for our little bit of chat together. I really appreciated it.
My pleasure. It was great chatting with you, Colleen. And I really do believe that that these offices are, and can be powerful tools for advancing a kind of broader vision of who we are.
Agreed.
It is, even if all you do is restore or build confidence of Center County constituents that someone is looking after their money the way they would, that's a worthwhile thing to do, because we are living in a time where I don't think there could be clearer evidence of the need for public institutions than what we're living through right now, and we have a lot of trust building ahead of us to get that confidence back. But I also think there are so many great examples of innovative ways that using these offices we can advance our shared vision as Democrats. It's great meeting you, great learning about the history you made. Let's hope the national ticket makes some history. And by the way, our state row officer ticket, I should mention my colleagues, Josh Shapiro and Nina Ahmad, we're about, I hope we'll make some history there too this year. So history making all around.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joseph, for joining us tonight and answering our questions. And thank you, Colleen, for asking some questions this evening. It was great getting to chat with both of you. Thank you to everyone that attended tonight. We are going to upload this on YouTube, if that's all right, with the Torsella team, so you can view it on there as well. Greg, did you have any last comments before we close out for the night?
No, I guess just kind of a follow-up. How important is it for us to maintain the other positions as Democratic positions for Attorney General and Auditor General to make your life easier?
Well, I cannot overstate how consequential these jobs, which we sometimes call the row offices, are. They are, these jobs, and I hope you have a sense of that from what I've talked about tonight. These jobs really matter. They really affect people's lives. So I think and Josh, I think has shown, what it's like to have someone who's determined to be the people's attorney in that office. I think we know from what Eugene DePasquale has done how important that is, and I work with both of these offices every day of every week on all kinds of issues. So I think we have to, if we're not excited by this ticket, we should be, but we need to be determined to keep these offices, to keep good Democrats in these offices, and to we have putting aside myself and Josh and Nina, we have two extraordinary public servants. We got to get them both across the finish line. We have a lot of work out there to do this year in what I think is really the most important election of my lifetime. But let's not forget that.